Hey everyone, welcome to the podcast. My name is Jeffrey and I'll be your host. We've taken a few weeks off from posting a podcast. We've had some summer camps going on, so it hasn't been a normal week here since early to mid-June. But with me today on the podcast is Ingrid Sorensen, and she was a guest on our podcast back in April. So if you're curious of what she talked about the last time, go back on our website and check that podcast out. How's it going, Ingrid?
Hi, Jeff. I'm doing well. Thank you for having me back. I'm really excited.
Good. We're glad to have guests on because with this whole quarantine thing, it's been very hard to get guests to come on this podcast. I've tried and failed. So I'm glad that someone is actually willing to talk with me.
Yeah, I was actually going to say, before I was so, well, I was going to say, I didn't mean to cut you off before, that our conversation in April about, historic sites and museums. 1 month later, there was sort of discussion, debate about statues and monuments. So you picked a very timely topic, and yet again, it looks like we're going to discuss another one. So I'm just really glad you thought of me in the first place. And like I said, I'm excited to be back.
I'm hoping that people don't just bash that first podcast because oh, every museum and monument sucks now. Like, please don't. Just listen. Be a kind.
Yeah, you might need a follow-up to explain, or maybe a new one. Just be like, hey, since our last topic, the conversation has really shifted to this debate. So, which is good.
Maybe in the coming weeks, I'll do a monuments podcast just to talk about some of our local stuff that's been going on because it's been crazy here.
Oh yeah, and I'm not sure if you heard the news in Chicago, but they just took down all of the Columbus statues within city limits, and I would not be surprised if there are more to follow.
Yeah, our current statues are still up, but there's protests and talks every day. So, it is what it is.
Very true.
All right, so we'll save that for a different day. But today, our latest podcast deals with 3 musicals that discuss different history topics and famous figures in the early years of our country. We're going to talk about 1776, Bloody Bloody, Andrew Jackson, and Hamilton. 1776 is a musical about the creation and signing of the Declaration of Independence. Bloody Bloody, Andrew Jackson is obviously about President Andrew Jackson, and Hamilton deals with Alexander Hamilton's life. So we're going to try and go in order that they came out. So we're going to start with 1776 for this podcast. So I'm just going to go through the basic kind of chronological order of what the musicals talk about, and then we'll do some professional critiques of each musical, and then we'll give our side of the critiques. So here we go.
Hey, can I ask a quick question?
Yes.
So it's probably obvious to me, but why did you pick these 3 musicals specifically? Would they have been contemporaries of Benjamin Stephenson, or why them specifically?
So these deal with kind of our time period in and around the Stephenson house. So Ben Stephenson was alive during the Revolutionary War, and he also was alive during the time of Hamilton and the power of the Democratic Republicans. And then he was part of the Andrew Jackson era too, especially since they both fought in the War of 1812. I thought these 3 musicals kind of brought us home of our period plus some of the other areas in and around the 1820s. But thanks for asking that question, because most people probably don't even know why I chose 3 random musicals.
Well, I mean, it's what if you had picked Les Mis or, Phantom of the Opera? So I'm okay, I'm sure there's a common theme here that we probably see, but just in case someone doesn't see the intersection of real history and musical theater, just thought I'd throw it out there.
Yeah. Definitely. All right. So we're going to go into 1776 first, which it showcases the discussion, ratification, and signing of the Declaration of Independence. The musical takes the main point of view from John Adams. Adams in this musical is seen as somewhat of an insufferable man by most of the other delegates at the Continental Congress. So the timeline just goes through their discussion of independence and just getting to the creation of a committee to draft a document. And then the group writes the first drafts of the Declaration, and we see some kind of common themes with Jefferson, Adams, and Ben Franklin. And then we get to where Jefferson presents the Declaration to the committee, and then the slew of revisions start, and John Adams goes ballistic with all of it. And then we finally get to the final voting and the adoption of the Declaration of Independence. The running time for this musical is about 2 hours and 45 minutes. So for some folks, that may be a long haul. But I think it's definitely worth it just to see some of the characters that some kids or adults may not know that had a bigger hand in the Declaration than we think. Because most people, it's considered Thomas Jefferson, and they don't really consider the other, 20 to 30 men who had a say in our Declaration. So some of the professional critiques that I found, one was Roger Ebert or Ebert. I'm not sure how to say his last name, but he was very critical of 1776. His statement I kind of picked out just a couple for the viewers. His first one is, it says, "This is an insult to the real men who were Adams, Thomas Jefferson, and Ben Franklin, and the rest. But then we've emasculated our founding fathers in story and song for so long that they're practically a set of caricatures." And then he has another short statement that says, "The performances trapped inside these roles, as you might expect, are fairly dreadful." So he is very critical of this musical, and I've seen some other critical ones too. But then I tried to find one that balances out his. So this other one that I have is from Common Sense Media, which they say this musical brings the founding fathers back down to earth and humanizes them and shows that they could be just as divided, just as prone to good and evil, just as irrational temper as any of us, especially the politicians of this or any other age. Teamwork, courage, and integrity are emphasized in this musical. So that one takes a little bit of a more holistic approach to the musical. They just don't dissect the play itself, but they actually dissect the men and the actors who are portraying them too. So I'm going to go into our critiques. I'm going to give mine first, and then I'll let Ingrid weigh in on her side. So as I stated, I've read a lot of negative reviews about 1776. In my opinion, some of them don't dive deeply enough into the presentation of the characters. William Daniels, who portrays John Adams, does an excellent job in doing so, because he shows that John Adams was the least liked member of this delegation from Massachusetts. The other delegates do their portrayals very well too. I think some critiques overlook the different aspects that go in this musical. We have New England that is at war with Britain. Several battles have already been fought by this point. Then we have the South, where they want to sit back and wait to see what happens in the Northeast, and then finally weigh in on what they really want. This is all on display in 1776. 1776 shows that compromises must be made for everyone to be on the same page. And we need to remember that these men will be killed if the revolution fails. So they all need to be in agreement, and it makes sense why the unanimous vote was called for and supported by John Hancock, who was the president. With all of its older style theatrics, this gives viewers a jumping off point to understand the delegates and their unique situation at the Continental Congress. So those are my thoughts, but what are your thoughts?
So like I said, I'm very thankful that you brought me to the show, but I also have a lot of opinions, so be prepared.
Go for it.
So one thing I do want to start off is I'm going to ask you a question, and then so it'll give you time to think about it while I give my critique as well. So I was just curious to see what your favorite scene or song is in the musical. So I'll give you some time to think about it, and then I'll delve into my opinion really quickly. So as you had pointed out, I do believe the musical refers to Adams as, quote, obnoxious and disliked, end quote, which, if we're being honest, has probably been used to describe me. So there are lots of things I do like about the musical. I do think some of the critiques were rather harsh and unnecessarily so. If you know the history of this time period quite well, in his diary and autobiography, John Adams even admits that one of the reasons he asked Jefferson to be on the Committee of Five and specifically write a majority of the Declaration is due to the fact that he is, quote, so obnoxious, unquote, and zealous in promoting independence. Adams himself feared that any draft he would submit would undergo a more, in quotes, severe scrutiny and criticism in Congress, unquote, than his colleagues. So that part, it's pretty accurate. And if we think about the time period this came out, 1776, I think you and I both watched the film version of it, but I think it actually hit either, Broadway or off Broadway in 1969. And if you think about that year, what was going on in America at that time, Vietnam War was occurring. We're almost at the bicentennial of this time period. So it's, how do we remember this time period? And are we, presenting it in a historically accurate way, or are we whitewashing it, for example? So to some of the, like I said, the harsh opinions, I guess I fail to see how it's an insult to the founders. And I wonder if it's just a different interpretation of the events. My personal opinion is, if anything, I think 1776 does a good job of making the founders more sympathetic. Hence why I agree more with the second critique you had mentioned. I think oftentimes history curriculum often glorifies or mythicizes the founders as heroes rather than portraying them as the complex humans that they actually were. For example, I read an excerpt from Adams. He kind of was insecure about himself, right? And that sort of reveals it. And I think 1776 also reflects that, right? He sort of, he and Abigail had lots of letters, right? So they sort of give a nod to that. I think one of the strengths of the musical is, as you had pointed out as well, it mentions, some of the lesser known founders, such as Richard Henry Lee, Edward Rutledge, John Dickinson, and more. I also think the musical is incredibly relevant. Like I said, if we think about the time period it was written in, as well as having common universal themes, I think many humans can relate to. Some examples might include divided politicians, right? Some of us may have that same sentiment thinking about our own Congress, right? Currently, right now, with the current political climate, defining freedom and what does that mean to America? Sort of socioeconomic clashes, right, with elitism and its impact and more. In addition to bringing attention to a very important historical time period and what I would consider timely, relevant topics, I also think the musical is rather well written. My personal favorite song is The Leaves of Old Virginia, due to its rhyme scheme. So especially when, Richard Henry Lee and Benjamin Franklin sing words that sort of rhyme. So social Lee, the emphasis, because Lee singing, so social Lee, politically, financial Lee, right? And like I said, the Lees were a prominent family in the colonies, and they get some attention in this musical. In addition to the good music, I also really appreciate the fact that 1776 sort of challenges or exposes lesser known facts about this time period, as I had mentioned. For example, it reminds the audience that I think a common misconception is people hear, July 4th of 1776 and think that's when the war actually started, when in reality it started a year earlier in 1775. So you see that at this point in time, some colonists were still considering reconciling with the crown. I think the musical refers to the olive branch petition, right? So not everyone was dead set on independence. I think a lot of times when history curriculum teaches it, they make it seem like everyone was a patriot, and that's also not the case, right? The musical refers to Benjamin Franklin and his son, who was, Benjamin Franklin was obviously part of Congress, and his son was a staunch, outspoken loyalist, right? So it even shows that families even very prominent ones, were divided on this topic of independence. Moreover, the musical reveals to us by the timeline that independence was actually not voted for on July 4th, even though we celebrate that as our Independence Day now, right? So it says, hey, it was an ongoing conversation over months, right? Moreover, and this is probably the aspect I appreciate most, this musical highlights the fact that the signers of the Declaration removed the anti-slavery grievance against the king, which I'm not sure how many viewers actually were informed about this in their schooling. It is true that this charge against the king did not make the final draft of the Declaration, and as a result of the founders' failure, to address this, slavery would remain legal until the Reconstruction Amendments, nearly a century later, and moreover, codified racial discrimination would continue far beyond the signing of the Declaration and its legacy. Overall, while, as we said, this musical is a bit on the long side, I do ultimately think that 1776 provides a good introduction to this topic and hopefully encourages people to learn more about the important events of this, this important event in national and global history. Because I think oftentimes, the Declaration is invoked or we take certain phrases from it, but when you read it in its entirety or when you see everything that went into its creation, 1776, does a good job of presenting a very good overview that I think is rather fair. I don't think it really glorifies them as much, and like I said, it makes them human. I think that's a lot of, I think it makes it more relatable. I think it's an aspect that often is lacking in history curriculum.
That was a good overview because you touched on a lot of the subjects that people probably miss if they're not in the historical mind, where you talked about the Lee family, and they're very prominent. You talked about the relationship between the North and the South, Ben Franklin and his son, and all of the cuts that they actually made to the document before it was approved by all of them. So make really good points in all of that assessment.
So do you have a favorite song or moment or scene from the musical? So unfortunately, You asked me to give my opinion. It was very long-winded, and I was just like, oh, no.
That's all right. So there's two scenes.
Oh, maybe he couldn't think and listen to me at the same time.
No, I have two scenes that I like the most. One being that when they're doing the debate over the Declaration of what Thomas Jefferson wrote, and they're just cutting out every small nitpicking, and some of them don't even make sense of why they are cutting it, but it offends one of the colonies, and that just reinforces to me that you needed to have everyone on the same page. If the South didn't agree, or if one of the middle colonies didn't think that they had enough going for them, then that was it. You would have gotten one no vote and nothing would have changed. And then I also do like that we had, John Adams saying that he wanted someone from the South to write the document and pre-oppose it. Because if you didn't have the South, then you wouldn't have the Northern votes as well. So you needed a whole committee to really figure out what they needed most. But we are unfortunately out of time for our first podcast. But Ingrid will be back for part 2, and we're going to talk about Bloody Buddy Andrew Jackson next time. So we will hear from Ingrid again. Thank you very much, Ingrid, for stopping by this afternoon.
Thank you for having me.